survivor of a failed abortion. In 1977, Melissa's 19-year-old mum had left hospital in the United States, believing that the toxic saline solution she'd been given over a 5-day period when she was 8 months pregnant had aborted her child. She thought her daughter had been delivered stillborn, but the abortion had failed, and Melissa's mother had no idea her daughter had survived. Melissa was adopted, but after learning about her traumatic start to life, she spent nearly 2 decades searching for her biological mother, who she learned had never wanted a termination in the first place.
You know, I grew up knowing I had been born prematurely. I grew up knowing I was adopted. What I didn't know, of course, was there was this great secret behind all of this. And so what I learned was that my 19-year-old birth mother, as a college student, had a saline infusion abortion. And that type of procedure was meant to poison me to death. And of course, the final step of the procedure was that I should have been delivered dead. And instead, I was actually born alive. And in the midst of that, there was a struggle about whether medical care would be provided to me. Ultimately, a nurse rushed me off to the neonatal intensive care unit, where medical care ultimately sustained my life.
And you, from your investigations, you were effectively discarded as medical waste. But you were making a noise. There were weak cries, as I understand it, which is when the nurse or a nurse was prompted to take you to intensive care.
Yeah, my parents had heard about a couple of nurses over the years, and we know for sure that there's one particular nurse that rushed me off. And we'll maybe never know how many nurses played a part in all of this happening. But what we do know is that at that hospital, where babies were actually put in the utility closet if they survived abortions. That's where they were typically left to die. And I'll probably never know if I made it to that utility closet. But what I'm grateful to know is that those nurses were willing to fight for me that day.
And you were just under 3 pounds, I think. You weighed just under 3 pounds. And presumably most medical professionals would have predicted that you wouldn't either live for very long, or that if you did survive, you would have disabilities.
Definitely, that was the prognosis. And, you know, thankfully, I've defied the odds time and time again. Like many premature infants, I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for a period of time. There were a few mistakes made in my care, and the doctors actually thought I would be blind. They also thought I had a fatal heart defect. But once again, you know, as the days passed on, they continued to be surprised by the progress that I made, and now I am a perfectly healthy adult today.
Which is astonishing, isn't it?
It is astonishing. I pinch myself some days. It often feels like I'm talking about someone else.
You were 14 when you began to learn about your traumatic start in life. How did it affect you when you found this out?
Oh, it affected me in a huge way. I don't think anybody's ever prepared for this kind of news. And to be 14 and really just struggling with who I was in the first place, this news was absolutely devastating. So not long after I learned the truth about my life, I really turned my pain upon myself. So developed an eating disorder, struggled with alcohol abuse, poor dating relationships, didn't want to be me, in all honesty. I had never heard of anybody like me years ago. Of course, now I know that there are many survivors like me, but you know, back then it was a really lonely, painful place to be.
And how did you find out?
My parents ended up having to tell me. It was really a complete mistake. My older sister became pregnant and was considering an abortion. And so my parents had told her about my survival so that she would understand the consequences of all the decisions that she was considering. And so my sister actually let it slip to me in the middle of an argument. She actually yelled out to me. She said, "You know, Melissa, at least my biological parents wanted me." And I couldn't understand those words. And She is the one who actually encouraged me to approach our parents that night for the truth about my life. And, I never saw that kind of news coming.
You decided to try to trace your birth family at 19. So you wanted to find the woman who had tried to abort you all those years earlier. It was complex, it was tricky. Tell me about when you first made contact with your birth mother.
It was complex. It took me over 10 years to find them. My biological mother and I didn't finally connect until a little over 5 years ago now. And what I learned through that experience is that there were even more secrets about my survival that I didn't know and my adoptive parents didn't know. And the biggest secret truly is that my birth mother had spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. She was not told that I survived. It was kept a secret from her. I was placed for adoption without her ever knowing. She never knew if it was a little boy or a little girl she had delivered in that abortion. And she had lived with such incredible regret and heartache. And so we started to communicate by email about 5 years ago and shared information, built walls of trust and love with one another before we met face to face for the first time about 2 years ago now.
And what was that like?
Absolutely surreal. It's one of those things that's hard to really describe to people, except, I don't know if you've ever been in the midst of an experience and you know that it was meant to be that way and that it's just one of those defining moments of your life. I will never forget meeting her and seeing her pain. Her pain haunted me for a very long time after that. But now I get to also experience her joy. When we moved to Kansas City, which is where we live here in the United States, when we moved here 5 years ago, what we didn't know is that my birth mother actually lives in this very same city. And so it's allowed us to forge this relationship. We connect on a regular basis. We see each other as often as we possibly can. One of my half sisters lives here also with her children. And so now my biological family is a huge part of my life.
You also learned that, because your mother told you, that she was put in a position of feeling forced to abort you. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my adoptive parents had been told, of course, that simply that the abortion had occurred, that every belief was that it was my biological mother's choice to do so. But through conversation with her, what I learned is that my grandmother, her mother, was a prominent nurse in their community, and that the local abortionist was a friend of hers and owed her some big favor. And so together, my grandmother and the abortionist literally forced the abortion upon my birth mother against her will.
I mean, is that possible? Do you believe that?
I do. I do. Knowing what I do about my grandmother and that abortionist, they simply were able to bypass the hospital regulations and procedures at the time that my birth mother would have had to go through. And so people at the hospital simply thought it was her choice. And she had no opportunity to fight back.
You also found out that your grandmother, who was a nurse at that hospital, had apparently instructed other people that day when you were aborted to, quote, leave the baby in the room to die.
That's a tough one. It really is. I know that's a tough thing for people to hear, and that's not been easy for me to live with either. But my grandmother is actually the one who was honest about that with other family members. This was not something that she wanted to have happen for me to continue to live. And that's also why I was rushed off to the NICU that day, is because those nurses who fought for me believed that they were literally saving my life once again.
What are your feelings now towards your biological mother and towards that grandmother?
Oh, I love my biological mother. I think I am one of the luckiest people in the world, to not only be alive and have my adoptive parents, but now have my biological mother and so many of her family involved in my life. And In terms of my grandmother, as much as that's hard knowledge for me to live with about the decision she made about my life, I'm not angry with her and I don't hate her. We all make mistakes in this life. I make them every single day. And so I don't hold that against her. My heart breaks for her because I will probably always wonder what it was in her life that led her to those kind of decisions about mine.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on to our programme.
Thank you so much.
And to find out more about Melissa's story, you can go to the news site. There's a long article there, and there's also her book, You Carried Me, A Daughter's Memoir, which is out now. Some messages from you. Lou Colvin says, horrendous, what a remarkable young woman. Spring on Twitter says this is a powerful story, showing there are two sides to every story. And Neville on Twitter, remarkable. What a remarkable story. Thank you for those.